Well, Australia's relationship with Asia is often in the headlines, but what about that other vital part of the region, the Pacific? How is the Australian government engaging with the Pacific, both economically and diplomatically? To look more closely at Australia's ties to the Pacific, I spoke earlier to Richard Marles, Parliamentary Secretary for Pacific Island Affairs. Richard Marles, welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here, Whitney.
Is Australia's relationship with the Pacific often eclipsed by its strong ties to Asia?
Well, our relationship with the Pacific is very central to our foreign policy. So at a government level, the role of the Pacific and its central importance is very clearly understood. I sometimes do think that the Pacific ought to play a larger role in our national discourse, and that sometimes the media would do well to focus more on the Pacific, because the Pacific is that part of the world where Australia's influence is greatest. What we do in the Pacific matters more than perhaps in any other part of the world. And correspondingly, the rest of the world understands that, and so it rightly judges us, for good or ill, on the way in which we behave and perform in the Pacific. So it is a very important feature of our foreign policy.
What sorts of strategies is the government adopting in terms of investing in the Pacific, and what particular countries are of interest?
Well, I think one of the big challenges which really faces the Pacific is how you come up with sustainable economies. And how you do that? Well, I think we need to be making sure that what resources these countries do have are able to be used as best as possible. It means that we need to be investing in critical infrastructure, particularly around things like tourism. But I think the most important thing is human capital. And in our development assistance program, we focus very much on health and on education to really maximise that human capital. And in turn, we need to be working towards a more economically integrated Pacific, so that people who are growing up in the Pacific have the opportunities to use their skills throughout the world. And so that's very much a focus of our efforts as well.
Richard Marles, the Lowy Institute recently released data from a survey on what Fijians want in terms of their government and how the country operates. Now, you had some criticisms of this survey. Why?
Well, the first thing to say is that the Pacific has had really a very grand democratic tradition since the various independence of all the countries in the Pacific. But the one country which really stands out against that trend is Fiji. And what we are seeing in Fiji at the moment is a government which is refusing to take any meaningful steps towards democracy, and in the process is really cracking down on human rights. It's not a good situation at all that we are experiencing in Fiji. Now, the Lowy conducted a poll, and I might say I've got very high views of what the Lowy does and the debate that it promotes. But in this instance, I think it was a mistake, because I don't think it makes much sense to conduct an opinion poll in a country where there is a repressive regime, where you're sitting at home and a stranger comes and knocks on your door, and where people do get taken off to the barracks and asks you a question about what you think about the government. I mean, I think in those circumstances, lots and lots of people are going to have a pretty obvious answer to that question, and that in turn is going to mean that the credibility of the numbers that come out of that poll have to be thrown into question.
Well, on that poll, the Lowy Institute says that respondents were given the opportunity to decline, and that Fijians are used to polling because they're surveyed quite frequently in that country. So they refute your claims that people would feel under pressure to say that they are happy with Frank Bainimarama and the government.
Well, I don't want to get completely absorbed in this one poll, but I do think that refuting of the claim is silly, and it's silly for this reason. If you look at the way in which polls are undertaken in our country, for example, where there is freedom of political expression and where people can feel completely free to criticise the government, there is a lot of effort which is taken by those pollsters to make sure that the way in which they engage in that polling activity is very scientific and that the numbers are robust. If there is even a small proportion of people who in Fiji felt concerned about the fact that a stranger was knocking on their door asking them about what they thought about the government, and in order to get that person to go away they said, well, of course we love the government. If only a small number of people behaved in that way, then the poll results are infected and they don't mean much. And that's the point I'm making. But I guess the other point is I don't see what we learn from that. I mean, the value of democracy is not a matter of opinion polls.
I think what we learned from that, though, is that up until this time there had been no hard data on what Fijians wanted from their government and policies there. So that's what this poll was endeavouring to do, was to provide data for the government. What's your response to that?
Well, if what is being sought is hard data, then we certainly didn't get it from that poll, and that's the fundamental point. It's not a credible poll when you're polling people in a repressive environment and where there is, even if a number of people felt that pressure upon them when they answered the questions. And so we don't get any hard data out of a poll of that kind, and indeed the data that we might get out of that poll can therefore be quite misleading. But the point I would really make is this: democracy is something you either believe in or you don't. And democracy is a central value of this country, of Australia, and has been a central value of the Pacific. And the question I really ask people like the Lowy, but indeed the commentariat in Australia, is whether that is a value that they would want our government, the Australian government, to stand up for within the region. That's what we are doing, and that is what the Fijian government don't like us doing, and that is the real nub of the issue here.
So will the government then, or will you be urging the government to conduct a follow-up poll to see if you come up with data that corresponds with what the Lowy Institute found?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of doing opinion polls in Fiji. What I think it's a matter of is the Fijian government taking some meaningful steps towards returning democracy to their country. And that's what we actually need to see, and that's what, of course, we encourage the interim government of Fiji to do every day. And the other point I made in the speech at the Lowy Institute is that it really wouldn't take much steps at all on the part of the interim regime, so long as they are credible steps towards democracy, to see a very different dynamic occurring in the Pacific and a very different dynamic occurring in the relationship between Fiji and Australia. Look, we stand very ready to engage with the interim government of Fiji in helping them return their country to democracy. We just ask for the smallest sign on their part that they're willing to do the same with us.
Richard Marles, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.